This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, well, we're recording, so it's official. Welcome to the March edition of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program TAC meeting. Um, I guess I'm new at this, but I guess on behalf of Kelly, who isn't quite here yet, um, I'm I guess co-leading the meeting. Um, what's next, Marcus? Do you want to jump right into your presentation, or should we?
I think that's good. Not too many people for introductions, so I think we'll just jump right into it in the interest of time.
Okay.
Definitely appreciate Ryan stepping up to be co-chair. As he said, this is the first time that he's chaired one of these meetings, and Kelly is still the other co-chair, but she'll be on hopefully soon. So yes, Ed and Maya are in DC this week, so the rest of the TBEP staff are kind of taking this TAC meeting on for ourselves. So you'll be hearing a lot from myself and Carrie and Sheila and Blake today. So I'll just jump right into it. I've got a presentation, then we've got Mary Lusk from UF, and then some updates on our CCMP, and that's pretty much it. So not really a full agenda today, but I'll just get into my talk. So, to give you some background on why I wanted to give this talk, um, I've been working on various trend analysis methods for a couple years now, and I've been doing it with some colleagues out in San Francisco at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and also having some conversations here with folks in Florida with Dr. Miles Medina at UF and Mike Wessel at Janicki. And we were sort of discussing this idea that there's different ways to do trend analyses, not just for places like Tampa or San Francisco that have long-term monitoring data sets, but kind of any place that kind of uses this information to make decisions about how a water body or an estuary is changing over time. So we've some of the methods we've been working on are kind of newish techniques that are, I guess, at the forefront of how people are thinking about trend analyses, and I want to talk about them today, make a case for them to see what the TAC thinks about them, and also maybe full disclosure, thinking about maybe some ways that the Water Atlas, which is of course a service that we use here, can maybe adopt some of these methods to report on trends in not just Tampa Bay, but maybe Sarasota, Charlotte Harbor, and other places in Florida. So a couple things I'll talk about today. I'm going to basically talk about some of the existing methods that are used, basically seasonal Kendall tests, which are the workhorse of trend analyses for many, many years. They work very well, but they come with a couple of assumptions and limitations that I think are not really getting at some more pointed questions about trend analyses that some of these newer methods can get at. So then I'll talk about some of these new techniques, in particular generalized additive models, which if you're not familiar with those, they're actually a lot like linear regression models, but are very flexible to deal with nonlinear trends as well as other ways to incorporate additional variables. So we've got some new techniques that I want to expose this group to and get you all comfortable with how they can help you address new questions. And then I'll talk about some comparisons between the more conventional approaches, the time series analysis, and some of these new methods, and why you might get different results and some of the benefits of using one approach versus the other. So with any trend analysis method, the basic goal is essentially you have a lot of monitoring data and you want to make sense of it. You want to ask questions of, is water quality changing over time? Is it improving or getting worse? Or is it responding to different drivers? Oftentimes, in the management community, we want to know if we implement some change, is that having an influence in the condition of our water body of concern? And also, once you kind of get that information, you want to be able to, at the foundation, have that strong statistical analysis, but distill those results for decision makers so they can very quickly say, again, is the water body improving? So these are some graphics from the Water Atlas right now, basically showing some of the methods that are used and distilled for decision makers. Looking at long-term monitoring data here, fitting a standard regression through these points, assessing the trend as increasing or decreasing, and categorizing it based on magnitude of the trend. And then you get nice summary maps like this that looks like, oh, water quality is not really trending in a good direction. So this is kind of how it's currently presented. And I think the basis for a lot of these methods, not just at the Water Atlas, but just around the country and the world, is these seasonal Kendall tests, and they've been used for several decades now. Definitely a very robust approach, but it comes with a couple assumptions and limitations that I want to talk about, and again, has served sort of the motivation for our exploration of these alternative approaches. So the reason that these tests are used quite often is that they assume the data are non-parametric. So essentially, water quality data don't follow a lot of the assumptions for more conventional linear analyses. So these approaches are kind of rank-based and follow sort of non-parametric stats and are much more flexible as a result. And the seasonal Kendall test in particular, it does let you evaluate sort of long-term interannual changes, but it does account for seasonal variation within a year. So we know that July water quality might be different from January water quality. So the tests allow you to account for that. It does assume that these seasonal changes are stationary between years. So July will have the same sort of trend in one year as it does the next year. So that is kind of a big assumption, but some of these newer approaches will help hopefully get around that limitation. They're sort of a short list of the limitations of Kendall tests. I think the biggest one is that it does require sort of this regularly spaced data, balanced data. In other words, it kind of assumes that you're sampling at the same time each month or each year. And it also tests for essentially a monotonic change. So is water quality going up or down? It doesn't account for, changes within a certain year period if it's going up or down within the period you're testing. So I think that's another very big limitation. It also is not very flexible for including additional explanatory variables. In other words, it basically tells you how water quality changes over time, but not how it's changing in response to other covariates like temperature or precipitation, things like that. Um, Saying that, there are some other methods available that can include additional explanatory variables in Kendall tests, but they're not widely used, and I think they come with definitely a lot of the limitations of these other points here. The final point is something that these newer methods that I'm going to talk about actually incorporate into the assessment. So there's a lot of uncertainty in just inherent observed data that these Kendall tests don't necessarily account for. It's just sort of a basic rank-based test that takes the observed data at face value. And if we're doing a trend assessment, we want to be able to include uncertainty in the data to make a more informed assessment of is the water quality actually changing. So that hopefully will be a little more clear as I explain these newer methods. But again, seasonal Kendall tests, the basis for a lot of trend analyses. It works very well, but it does come with some assumptions and limitations. But what people tend to use this analysis for is this very simple question of, I want to know if there's a consistent change across seasons over time. So this test will give you that answer, but as I said, has a couple limitations. So when we're thinking about alternative approaches to trend analyses, this was, again, discussions that I was having with colleagues over the last couple of years. We sort of talked about the limitations of Kendall and sort of outlined some needs moving forward. So we want to basically have the ability to estimate not just linear trends over time, but nonlinear trends in water quality. We know it's highly dynamic. We want to be able to separate trends on different time scales. So not just is it changing between 1990 to 2000? Is it changing across different year periods, but also is the July change different from the January change? We want the ability to say those or evaluate those questions as well. We want to propagate uncertainty in the observed data through all phases of the analysis so that we have more confidence in the final assessment because we've been able to address the inherent variability in the water quality data. As I mentioned, Kendall test does require sort of regularly spaced and balanced data. And so we want to have a trend assessment method that's robust to maybe how different monitoring programs might be sampling data over time. And as I said, we also want to have the ability to evaluate not just the changes over time, but how it might be changing as a function of other variables that we know are driving water quality. So instead of that simple question of, we want to know what is the monotonic change in water quality over seasons, we want to ask more nuanced questions of, I might want to know how the mean or the maximum or the variability of chlorophyll within a particular season is changing based on a long-term monitoring data set that we know has possibly varied sampling designs over time, and have that significance of that change account for the uncertainty in the observed data. So that's kind of a tall order, but what we're trying to do with this method. So this is the approach we've proposed. It is actually outlined in detail in this paper that came out last year. Essentially, it's a multi-step process that does give you an answer of it's going up, it's going down, and here's the certainty we have in that conclusion. But it involves multiple steps to help you get to that answer with more confidence. So this is a long-term monitoring data set from, I believe, San Francisco Bay. And the first thing we do is fit a generalized additive model to this data set. So looks fairly simple. It's a flexible model. It's evaluates these nonlinear trends across years and within seasons. And what's great about fitting a GAM is if we have a sampling data set with varied history, we can fit a smooth approximation of that data set and have uncertainty associated with any point in the time series. And this gets important when we talk about propagation of uncertainty through the analysis. So here's the time series we can fit, and from that we can extract these sort of seasonal metrics. And so essentially what this tells us is this is the average chlorophyll or the maximum chlorophyll or the variance of the chlorophyll within any given year for a particular season of interest, whether that's July or January or the whole year. And we're able to extract these because we have this GAM fit with standard errors associated with it. So essentially we get this metric of interest and confidence around that we can then use as the basis for evaluating interannual changes. Okay, so we can extract this from the GAM, and then we use that as a basis for assessing trends. And so this is just showing you, maybe we want to assess the trend from 1990 to 2010 or 2010 to present. And then this fit here uses an additional modeling step that I'll talk about called mixed effects meta-analysis, which is a lot like linear regression, but it fits the regression through these points while accounting for the uncertainty around these seasonal metrics. So it's an additional step to say, let me fully propagate the uncertainty of these different approaches to have more confidence in the trend. So that's the basis of it. A couple of different steps there, but hopefully I'll convince you that this is a more nuanced and a more appropriate way to evaluate the trends. So in a little more detail, again, first step, fitting the model. This is the basic structure of the GAM. The one we kind of settle on was very simple. It looks like a regression in the sense that you're modeling a response variable as a function of an intercept and an independent variable. And in this case, it's continuous numeric value for time. And this F function is basically the smoothing function for the GAM. So it's a series of basis splines that are connected by several knots that join them together in a continuous time series. So we have this GAM here. We then use that to assess our seasonal metrics, as I said. And I wanted to show this plot up here. This is the GAM fit from the previous slide, but because we have uncertainty associated with that GAM, it's a function of the observed data that goes into it. we can extract these seasonal metrics as the basis for our trend test. And again, these seasonal metrics are describing what is the average response of chlorophyll, or the maximum response of chlorophyll, or the minimum response. And we can take these subsets basically for the whole year or certain parts of the year, whether it's spring or summer. So we can sort of query the model that way, not just what is the interannual change for the whole year across different periods, but what is the seasonal change across different periods. So we have these metrics, and then we can use our mixed effects meta-analysis to actually say, is the water quality changing based on whatever our metric of interest is. And so, like I said, this is a simple linear analysis, but it has this extra term here that basically says, let me fit it through these metrics, but add these sources of uncertainty as a part of the actual model to actually propagate the full errors from the GAM into our trend test. So in this case, we say, okay, looks like water quality and chlorophyll is improving over time. We can test a different time period and say, oh, it looks like water quality is improving, or chlorophyll is decreasing. So that's the test. Then, of course, we want to say, well, why do we get different answers if and when we get different answers using different approaches? So how does this new method maybe tell us new information in terms of understanding, is it a more appropriate approach given the data? And so in the paper that we published, we compared it to some very simple analyses. So basically, one test we did was looking at essentially linear regression through averages of the raw data. And that's kind of what this top plot shows. So we have a monitoring data set with multiple months through several different years. We basically said, let's take the average within a year and fit a linear regression through that. What is the trend we get? And then the next thing we did was comparing sort of the same approach, but taking the averages from the GAM estimates for the same years, but not accounting for the uncertainty associated with the GAM metrics. So basically the same as this, but taking the averages from the GAM smooth, which again can account for changes in the sampling design by creating a linear, or rather a smooth fit through those points. And then finally, the last test was the one using the full model, so taking the GAM fit and using the mixed effects meta-analysis that really accounts for the full propagation of uncertainty through the assessment. So based on these comparisons, for this example, this fit shows that it's not significant. This fit through the GAM estimates using linear regression shows that it is significant. And then this fit using the full analysis shows that it's not significant. So you get different results, but I think you could make the argument that this final analysis that has the full propagation of uncertainty is quite more robust given the data that you're looking at. And based on which test you can use, you could say that this might be the correct result, but for the wrong reasons. This is an incorrect result, so it could be a false positive. And then I think this, you could say, that is the more appropriate result because we're using a more robust assessment. Now, turning it on its head, this is another example using the same analyses, but in this case, we get a non-significant result from simple regression. We get a non-significant result from simple regression, but using the GAM estimates. And this one shows a positive result, or actually a significant result using the full analysis. And so here looks like, these are potentially false negatives, but here, because we're using a more robust assessment, you could say that, this is actually the trend given the data that have, the characteristics with all its nuances. So, just to show you, again, you get different results depending on the method, but final analysis we think is a better way to assess the trends because it uses a flexible model and propagates uncertainty through all steps. Comparing it to seasonal Kendall, this is a quick analysis I did for Tampa Bay, looking at the last 10 years essentially. This is total nitrogen on the left, chlorophyll A on the right, and these are basically the trends from the GAM and mixed effects meta-analysis, and these are the trends using seasonal Kendall. So you'll see that, just looking at the bay in general, it looks like total nitrogen, we're doing great. It's going down in the last 10 years. Chlorophyll, as there are some problem areas in the bay. Old Tampa Bay has, the water quality has decreased over time because of these sort of recurring seasonal pyridinium blooms, and that is reflected in the data, not necessarily a big surprise. But the point of this slide is to show you that in this case, it looks like the results from our approach using GAMS compared to seasonal Kendall are very similar. And this was not surprising to me because this is using a data set from EPC that has a fairly regular sampling design. It's balanced. They go out every month at the same locations. And, based on the two approaches, I'm not necessarily surprised that they give us similar results. Now, if we want to contrast that to a different location that has a much more variable sampling history, we can look at Charlotte Harbor. So this is actually an analysis from Miles Medina at UF. He was looking at kind of the same approach, but comparing a much more variable sampling design. They've used different sampling data sets, or rather different sampling methods over the years, combining from different programs. And based on this analysis, Miles found that essentially there's a lot more discrepancies comparing seasonal Kendall versus this newer approach with GAMS. Now, 90% of the time, there was no discrepancy. So he was looking at the direction of the trend and the magnitude of the trend. And so if there was no discrepancy in those two things, he said, okay, it's great. But about 10% of the time, or 13% of the time, there was a discrepancy. So 11% of the time, there was a discrepancy in the trend direction. So essentially, seasonal Kendall said it was going up, but the GAM said it was going down, or vice versa. Or there was a discrepancy in the trend magnitude. And this was much less cases. So the direction was the same, but the actual magnitude of the change was different. This might not seem like a lot, 90% are in agreement, but these other 13% of the time, this could be a really costly conclusion if you get a false positive or a false negative using these more conservative methods. If you're making decisions that are, require a lot of money and you want to have, obviously a lot more certainty in your conclusions. So looking at these results in a little more detail, these are looking at basically the 1,000 or so tests where there was a discrepancy in the direction of the trend. So these are the Kendall test results on the right. These are the GAM results, or on the left rather. These are the GAM results on the right. And most of the time when there was a discrepancy, essentially the seasonal Kendall test says there was no trend, but the new method says there was a trend in a particular direction, whether that be up or down. And so to me, this is telling me that, these are false negatives, and these, because our approach is a little more sensitive to the actual characteristics of the monitoring data, these are actual trends that are worth noting that would have been missed using this more conservative Kendall test. One of the other pitches I want to make for GAMS, as I said in the beginning, is that you can not just look at how water quality variable changes as a function of time, but you can sort of query the model by throwing in other explanatory variables. And this is just an example, I believe, again, from San Francisco estuary, but looking at how chlorophyll changes as a function of temperature. And you could put in any variable here. You can put in any type of smooth. In this case, we're looking at how temperature interacts with season, using day of year as the other covariate. So this model gives us the ability to look at these long-term annual changes using continuous year, but again, also how temperature affects chlorophyll within each season. So this plot shows that interactive smooth here, showing you that, yes, okay, chlorophyll changes with season. It's higher in the summer, lower in the winter, but how temperature also affects chlorophyll as it varies throughout the year. So very flexible. You can kind of show, essentially understand how an independent variable influences a response variable at different levels, depending on your question. So that's a nice feature. Of course, we have other products that can help decision makers distill these results. This is just a quick dashboard that we put together to show you. You can use these models in a very flexible front end to basically distill the information to quickly answer various questions. And so with this dashboard, you can sort of evaluate what is the part of the year you want to look at. So if I want to look at July changes between years or January changes between years, you can use this slider to select the day range you're looking at. In this case, it's actually the late summer, early fall period. And this slider lets you look at particular years to evaluate that trend. So here we're just looking at 2015 to 2019 for the mixed effects meta-analysis. And the summary metric you want to look at, you can also change. So, most of the time you want to look at how is, the mean value changing, but you might want to be thinking about other metrics like, is the maximum value of chlorophyll changing between seasons as something that's more sensitive. So we have the ability to evaluate various metrics as well. And surprise, surprise, this is also facilitated by the development of an R package that we created that implements all of these methods. So we're trying to make this very easy for people to use. This package lets you fit the model, it lets you assess performance, view the predictions, and test these trends in different ways, looking at different metrics, year ranges, seasonal ranges, etc. So I'll wrap it up there, but we do think that this approach is a fairly robust way to address certain shortcomings of these more conventional methods. It also adds on a lot of different features that, depending on your question, could be of value to you. Seasonal changes or different metrics of interest. And as when I showed you the comparisons, like I said, most of the time you will probably get the same answer. But if you're looking at trends with monitoring data that has a varied history, I think these newer approaches with GAMs and meta-analyses are more sensitive to that. And because they have sort of the full propagation of uncertainty through the characteristics of the data and the modeling approach, you're likely to get an answer that's more correct for those small percentages of time when it might be important to have a more correct answer. So, you can say, is this of interest to you? Like I said, if you get the same answer, how important is it to you to get the right answer? I think, if your decision can have costly outcomes, I think it's very important to have the right answer. But if you just want to have a general understanding of changes over time, then maybe the more conventional approaches are more appropriate. So I'll stop there. But as I said, I'm not trying to necessarily sell this approach. I'm just curious what the TAC thinks about it. And in particular, I want to know essentially from you all, if you are trying to trend test, or you are using some of the products from the Water Atlas, what kind of information do you want from it? Is it as simple as going up, going down, magnitude of the trend, or is it more detailed that you'd like? How do you use these existing tools just for your own knowledge, or actually use them in some, like a regulatory context or something more specific than that? So appreciate people listening to me, and if there are questions about this or discussion points, I'd be happy to entertain them now.
Thanks, Marcus. Looks like there's a question in the chat.
In the chat.
Is that Stacy? Yeah, Stacy's question. So Stacy says, what is the amount of data needed for a GAM? Number of data points, minimum number of years, etc. We've developed these approaches to work well with kind of the standard monitoring design for most long-term water quality monitoring programs. So monthly, essentially, or even you could probably get away with less frequently than that. So maybe bi-monthly or quarterly even. With any analysis, the more data you have, the better. But I think if you're trying to, look at questions of, is the trend changing within 2 or 3 years? I don't think it's necessarily super robust to that time frame. I mean, your error bars will get larger the smaller data set you have, but we think it works fairly well for looking at decadal changes or longer than that. But we essentially develop the approach to be flexible and kind of accommodate to the characteristics of the data that you're using. So Pinellas County, I think, has a great data set to try this on, and I'd love to explore that a little bit more. So I'd like to know if people are using the Water Atlas to evaluate trends, and if they, find that appropriate, or does it, are there additional things that people want to know for that information?
Hey, Marcus, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great presentation. I myself have not used GAM, but certainly there is, there's definitely useful information in the Water Atlas. My question is more, I guess, related to, the notion of applying GAM for water quality monitoring at different points throughout the year. I think you raised the point about, say, water quality analysis in July or August versus that of January. And in my opinion, I think this probably does have merit, particularly because, seagrass, submerged aquatic vegetation habitat in Tampa Bay is so reliant on water quality. So I think if this adds maybe a higher level of confidence as to what those water quality attributes are, I think this may be helpful. I mean, I welcome other ideas from the TAC. However, again, I'm not versed well in GAMS. I just learned the acronym this morning. So, what do you think about that? Maybe perhaps about informing presence, absence, abundance, health of seagrasses in Tampa Bay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just generally speaking, it seems that the water quality monitoring community is moving towards scams as an approach. Like Chesapeake Bay program, for example, has been using GAMS for a while as the basis for their reporting. Um, it's also useful to sort of distinguish it between using them to just understand how it's changing. So GAMS as a function of time, and that's kind of what I'd like to push as an approach, given all the flexible ways to accommodate different types of monitoring data. But the second side of it is kind of what you're talking about, Mark, is using GAMS to inform drivers of change. So not how it's changing, but why it's changing. Um, Seagrasses are interesting because that's a data set that we don't get information every month, and it'd be great if we did, but it's just impractical to do that. But we can, with the water quality data, ask other questions of, possibly if chlorophyll is driving changes in water quality that is affecting the light habitats. And so if we're doing that, we can ask questions of how is it changing, but why is it changing? What's driving it? Are there, we have a lot of questions like, is climate change possibly driving this? And so throwing in temperature into the model is one way to do it. And I don't necessarily see that as the focus of like routine reporting, but because the models are so flexible, we can actually use them to evaluate questions like that in more detail. And so that's an area of active research. There's a lot of ways to develop a GAM. As I showed you in one example, we're just looking at temperature, how it interacts with day of year, within a season, but you can use a smooth for temperature as its own thing or have it with other interacting variables. So there's a lot of ways to slice and dice it, and it really depends on your question. It also depends on the quality of the data, obviously, like any model. Um, but there's definitely a lot of opportunities, I think, to answer those types of questions, and an underutilized resource in my mind.
Is it difficult? Is it kind of again, forgive my naivety or oversight on this. Is it basically a plug and play using the raw data, it looked like, rather than a much heavier lift in analyzation of the collected data? Could you clarify that?
It's really easy to build these models. There's some really accessible tools in R. The MGCV package, it actually comes with the base R installation now because it's very popular. But I guess the more important question is, how easy is it to build the right model? And that's more of a stats question. You could build any model you want. You can get results. They might be garbage. They might be not. And we've actually been working with a very knowledgeable statistician at Berkeley to develop these tools. And I know Chesapeake Bay program has a statistician basically on retainer to help them as well. And we kind of, we're not experts in GAMs, but we know kind of the systems and the ecology, and we kind of build these things, and we go back to the ecologist with our hat in our hand, and we say, "Is this right?" And he usually like admonishes us a little bit, but then tells us the more correct, the parsimonious way to do it. So the bigger challenge is have you developed a model that's appropriate for your question within the limits of the data set, essentially? And it never hurts to bring a statistician on board.
Thank you, Marcus.
Another question. Steve Myers had his hand up.
Yeah, hey Marcus, thank you for that. A very nice presentation. I'm wondering, you talked about trend analysis, and I think you may have touched on this issue, but what about like covariance between different quantities when they're both noisy? Is this something that's useful for that? I'm wondering, thinking like, for example, like, sea level rise and seagrass coverage, or temperature and seagrass coverage, things like that.
I mean, it's just the GAM is essentially like any simple model where you have a response variable and you want to understand how it changes as a function of some other variable. As I was, I think, explaining with Mark, that I think about them in terms of a model that is how it's changing versus why it's changing. But you could easily throw time out of that equation and just look at, two state variables to understand covariance, like seagrass changing as a function of some other thing like time or temperature or water quality. So it's like any other model, you could do that. It just depends on how deep you want to get into it. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but they're flexible.
It might be like worth looking into at some point.
Yes.
I just don't know, because when they're both noisy, then it might change things a little bit.
Yeah. And the other thing I was thinking too is you can have random effects in these models too. If there's a source of variation that you don't want to necessarily understand its particular influence, but account for its influence in the model. If you're evaluating other effects, fixed effects, how it influences a dependent variable. So that might address the issue somewhat. But if you're familiar developing GLMs or linear models in R, you can effectively do the exact same thing with GAMs, but it does let you evaluate essentially nonlinear trends more effectively.
All right, thank you.
I think there's one last question in the chat from Natasha. How does it incorporate special study or shorter term data sets that could supplement longer term data sets? And then I think that'll be the last question before we move to the next presentation.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of saying the same thing that I was just explaining with Steve, is that, it's like any model, it's data limited. If there's a particular variable that doesn't, doing time series analysis, if that variable doesn't cover the whole record, then you can't use it in the model. You just have a bunch of missing data. But if there is a particular period of time, where you have like just special study data that's for like 1 year, and you have a high resolution of, whatever response variable we're looking at within that year, you could evaluate that separately. But, you can't really put particular data set in there that's just missing a lot of information. If you're looking at a much larger data set, it's just going to be limited by that.
Marcus, I have one question. This is Stacy. Just thinking about your question about like what would we want to see from trend tests. I know we've done longer term tests, shorter term tests. Something of interest, in there's probably a way to do it. I don't know. Like, could you roll forward like through a time frame and like find when do you see the trends shift? When do they go from up to down or something like that? I think that would be really useful for us as far as being able to diagnose what's causing the trends and maybe act on them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an area of active research, and we have some kind of brute force ways to do that in the package. It's not very elegant, but essentially you can pick like a 5-year window or a 10-year window, whatever you want, and fit the model 1 year at a time, moving that window up, and you can kind of see you can plot essentially the slopes of each model in that moving window to see, oh, it's changing at this point around this window, or it's going up or going down, and because people want to know when the change happens, but there's a lot of like user inputs that influence that result, like 10-year window or a 5-year window, and that could influence it. But we do have some tools in the package that can help get at that answer. But it would be nice to know, like, more quantitatively, when the trend is actually going up or going down using, well, our statistician is on it, let me put it that way. But we can talk offline about some of the options in the package that might get at that question.
Great, thanks. And just one more thing, and I know Mike Wessel has helped us with a lot of our analysis, so he's very aware. The other thing that I think is important for a lot of us is to know the effect of the rainfall. So like we have done like some rainfall normalization on our data, so to incorporate that so that if it's a really rainy year, you can take out that effect and look at the other impacts.
Yeah, essentially like hydrologically normalized predictions. The GAMs can do that very easily. And the Chesapeake Bay program does that in their GAMs. The ones that we've developed don't do that just yet, but it is something that can be added easily into the model. You just use rain and then, fit the predictions with holding, rain at some constant value, maybe the mean, or you predict across the range of values for the rain and then average out sort of in a post hoc test. But yeah, short answer is it's doable.
Hello? Okay,
Yes,
sorry.
Natasha?
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to type, but my chat box is being very weird and won't let me type too much. I just have a few questions as well. So do you find that people or programs that are implementing these GAM analysis, do they continue to run the more traditional Kendall test alongside the GAM? Is there any comparison to be made? Because one of the things is, when you switch to a new analysis, how do you educate, inform, and kind of, transition smoothly without, like how do they relate, I guess? And are running both still valuable to a program, or is it kind of one of those things where you graduate to GAM because you have, decades of probabilistic data or something like that? So that's the first question. And then the second one is, you talked about a package. Is this all open science where it's pretty easy to implement and get running, or can you offer any brief, I know we're going to talk offline, but any brief guidance or expectations about a time frame of implementing?
Yeah, we need to move on to the next speaker, but I'll just quickly answer it. The first question, I don't know if there are a lot of programs that are really transitioning to these new methods. Well, aside from Chesapeake Bay program, they've developed their methods maybe about 10 years ago, not more than 10 years ago, and I'm certain they were using seasonal Kendall before that. So it might be worth looking at what they're doing. I see value in continuing an assessment time period using a method that's been used for a while if it's no overhead, because it's useful to know why you might get different results, because they are going to be in the minority, as I said, but they're still interesting use cases because there could be something going on that's worth paying attention to, because I think these approaches, these newer ones, are more sensitive. The second question you asked was, it's all there, but it's more of a matter of how do we operationalize it within the infrastructure of, say, the Water Atlas. I certainly don't want to run the stats each year we do them, but there's ways to sort of automate it and have the data flow in naturally or automatically and have it run the stats and serve it up. So that's a discussion for I think you and I. And I am planning on having a call with Water Atlas and Pinellas, Manatee, and Hillsborough County. Anyone else that's interested in joining that, I think we'll sort of get in the details about if and how and why we might want to implement this more intentionally. So, all right, I've talked enough, so I'll just pass it back to Ryan to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thanks, Marcus, and thanks for that good discussion. Our next speaker, I believe, is Mary Lusk from UF, and talking about atmospheric nitrogen deposition and water quality in Tampa Bay. And right now, I only see a black screen. I'm not seeing your slides, Mary. Oh, there we go.
We see the editing version.
Okay, you got the slides and we're good to go?
We don't see the
it's not.
presenter screen yet.
Just seeing the PowerPoint, but not in presentation mode.
Let's see if I can fix that.
There we
Is that
go.
better? Okay. All right, well, thank you for letting us join you today and tell you about our project Up in the Air and Down in the Water. This project was funded by Tampa Bay Estuary Program's Environmental Restoration Fund. And it is in collaboration with Dr. Cynthia Heil at the Red Tide Institute at Mote Marine in Sarasota. And all of the work is being carried out by Amanda Mooney Morgan, who is a PhD student in my lab here at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center that's in Hillsborough County. So we're University of Florida, but we're right here in Hillsborough County, which is great because it gives us an opportunity to do work related to water quality needs in the Tampa Bay area. So I am just going to take honestly 5-10 minutes and show you one aspect of the research that we've been doing. We have several moving parts, but I'm just going to focus on one of those moving parts today. So again, the objective of the whole program is to look at connections between the atmosphere and water quality in Tampa Bay. And you guys, I'm sure, are aware of Tampa Bay's airshed, where we have atmospheric air masses that come from many different directions and that contribute to rainfall in the Tampa Bay area. And of course, all of that rainfall, regardless of which air mass direction it comes from, carries some load of atmospheric nitrogen with it. And some earlier data from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program indicates that about 57% of annual total nitrogen load to Tampa Bay, of course, originates from atmospheric deposition. That's just nitrogen that's naturally in that rainfall, and that comes in many different forms. It can be ammonia nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen or organic nitrogen. And of that, about 57% of the total nitrogen load to Tampa Bay. There is some portion of that, of course, is just direct rainfall onto bay water, so about 17% of it. And the remainder of that comes from stormwater runoff from the watershed. So we've got rainfall falling on the watershed, generating stormwater runoff, and that it eventually makes its way out to bay waters, and anything that it picks up along the way, it's getting some nitrogen, and also has the original nitrogen that was just in that rainfall. So just some numbers there to keep in mind. This is a huge source of nitrogen transport to the Tampa Bay estuary, and what we want to do with this project is look at nitrogen in just bulk rainfall and then stormwater runoff. And we're analyzing forms and concentrations of nitrogen in those water sources. So forms of nitrogen would be, for example, nitrate nitrogen versus ammonia nitrogen versus dissolved organic nitrogen. And then we're also looking at how different harmful algal species in the Tampa Bay area respond to that nitrogen in those water samples. So for what I wanted to present today, this is some work that, again, PhD student Amanda is working on and has been working on for the last year or so. And on the map there, you can see some sample sites. And let me just explain what the map here means. So the little blue raindrops are where we're collecting atmospheric deposition or just rainfall. It's wet deposition only. So little blue dots are where we are collecting rainfall. The green circles are where we are collecting stormwater runoff, and you'll see that we have a green circle up on the Bay side and then some down on the Gulf side of Pinellas County. Stormwater runoff, again, we're just analyzing for forms and concentrations of nitrogen at various times throughout the year, getting some wet season and some dry season samples. The red triangles indicate where Amanda collected stormwater runoff to incubate with Carina brevis and to see a growth response from Carina brevis with stormwater runoff. And the yellow triangles up on the Bay side indicate where she collected stormwater runoff to incubate with Pyrogenium bahamans for to see growth response of that algal species with nitrogen from stormwater runoff. So a couple of different things going on. We're getting rainfall, we're getting stormwater runoff, and we're also getting some stormwater runoff just for incubating with several or two of those harmful algal species that we, of course, are so common in our coastal waters here. So I wanted to just focus today on the data for that Carina brevis bioassays, which is basically just taking that stormwater runoff again and incubating it for a certain amount of time with Carina brevis cells that were cultured in the lab. And we're looking at the growth response of that organism and how it's using nitrogen in that stormwater runoff. So here's a little bit of the experimental design that Amanda is using. You can see a picture there of her flask where she has stormwater runoff inoculated with Carina brevis cells and growing in a growth chamber at the lab here at our research center. It was maintained at 23 degrees Celsius and had a 12-hour light dark cycle. Her treatments included a low rainfall treatment. So this would simulate like a 0.4 inch rainfall event. Very common. Many of our rainfall events in the Tampa area are right about that range. But of course, as you know, we sometimes have much higher rainfall events. So she also has a high rain experimental treatment as well, and that simulates a 2-inch rainfall event. And then another treatment, there are two other treatments. One is from a beachside residential community stormwater runoff, and a fourth one from a mainland residential community stormwater runoff. And again, just incubating those 4 water sources, 2 rainfall and 2 stormwater runoffs with Carina brevis over time, looking at cell concentrations of that organism. And then we're also looking at species of nitrogen, nitrate nitrogen, ammonia nitrogen, dissolved organic nitrogen. And we also have dissolved organic carbon data as well, though I know this group we're going to be mostly interested in the nitrogen. Let's see. So just quickly, some preliminary data from this experiment. This is Carina brevis, again, Carina brevis growth response for the 4 treatments that we had there. We have, and including a control as well. So we have a control, which is just deionized water. And then the RL is the rainfall low. So that's rainfall simulating about a 0.4 inch rainfall event. Rainfall high is simulating about a 2-inch rainfall event. And the beach, again, stormwater runoff from a residential beach community, and mainland stormwater runoff from a residential mainland community. And what you'll notice from here is that Carina cells, they grew in all of those treatments, but they really grew in that high rainfall event treatment, and in the stormwater runoff from the residential community in the south coastal Pinellas County beach area. So just showing growth of those cells with time, and particularly a really strong response again with that high rainfall event and our stormwater runoff. So we're interested in not only if the cells were growing, but what species of nitrogen were they using? And this data shows the species of nitrogen that are being used. So nitrate nitrogen there on the left, it's staying relatively unchanged. It actually goes up in concentration a little bit with time, probably just some nitrogen cycling that's taking place in those flasks. But for the most part, not a lot of difference in nitrate nitrogen. But on the right side, look at that ammonia nitrogen, how much concentrations in ammonia nitrogen go down in time as those Carina brevis cells are growing. So really showing here the preference of those cells, preference of that organism for the ammonia nitrogen, because we're seeing how that's being utilized with time and it's going down in concentration. Next, same types of charts. We're looking at this time with dissolved organic carbon on the left and dissolved organic nitrogen on the right. I'm going to focus our conversation here today on dissolved organic nitrogen. Dissolved organic nitrogen, we're seeing that it's accounting for about 50 to 70% of the total dissolved nitrogen that's in our stormwater samples. So most of the nitrogen that's in our samples is in that dissolved organic form. And you can see here that there's this decrease in dissolved organic nitrogen up to about 72 hours as those K. brevis cells are growing. But then it kind of, after it decreases for a while, it starts to pop back up again. And Amanda's in the process of doing some work to sort of tease out what's going on there. She thinks that we're seeing some compounds that are very labile or bioavailable early on, but as time goes by, the organisms are using that organic nitrogen and then perhaps remineralizing some of it, or releasing microbial exudates that may be bringing that organic nitrogen back up a little bit. So we were still in the process of taking a look at what's going on there. The work that she is doing next will be involved compound-specific investigation of those organic nitrogen compounds. So organic nitrogen is not just one compound, it could be tens of thousands of potential compounds. So we're going to be doing some really in-depth look at individual compounds and seeing which ones are being used and which ones are being produced, sort of the front end of that curve and the right side of that curve, to see which compounds are Carina brevis using, which ones are being produced in that bioassay. So that will give us some information about which compounds need to be targeted in stormwater runoff so that we can perhaps help mitigate growth of those Carina brevis cells when they're exposed to nitrogen from runoff. So just some next steps that we're working on. Amanda just returned from a research cruise in February where she was out in the Gulf and collecting natural populations of K. brevis and doing those bioassays within natural population on the ship instead of in the lab. So we're in the process now of getting all that data looked at and analyzed. And again, the next step is to look really hard at that dissolved organic nitrogen and try to really identify which specific organic compounds are being used so that we can target those and make recommendation strategies for how we might target those compounds in urban stormwater runoff. And we also have done the same analysis with pyridinium, but just in interest of time today, I'm not presenting that data, but if any of you would like to take a look at that or talk to us about it, absolutely shoot me an email or let me know. We can talk about that as well. My email address is here if anybody would like to reach out and talk some more. And again, we'd be happy to do so. So I will stop there and take any questions.
Thanks, Mary. Not seeing any questions in the chat. Steve Myers has his hand raised.
Yeah, hey, Mary, thank you for that. Nice presentation. So you're talking about future steps. I'm wondering, is it possible with your chemistry or other methods for doing this to differentiate the nitrogen sources down from between those from combustion versus fertilizer versus waste. Is that something that's going to be done, or is that I'm involved in some other projects that involve nitrogen, so I'm wondering what it takes to make that to distinguish those sources.
Yes, certainly. So, and that is part of the work that we are doing with this project. Now, we were able to use, for example, stable isotopes to do some source tracking for the nitrate that's in these samples. We can look at the isotopic composition of nitrogen and oxygen and the nitrate ions in those samples, and that does allow a good bit of source fingerprinting, so to speak. So we can say, nitrate fertilizers versus pet waste versus um, lightning or atmospheric sort of processes. So we can do that with the nitrate. It is not as easy with the organic nitrogen, which is a stinker because again, half or more of the total nitrogen that's dissolved in our Tampa Bay area stormwater is in an organic form. That is why that's one of the reasons that we're doing one of the next steps that we're doing is taking this and doing some really high resolution mass spectrometry data, which doesn't give us a lot of information about sources, but it does tell us the chemical composition of some of those organic compounds, which helps us a little bit kind of get some clues about where those sources may be.
And is that already in process, or is that? I'm wondering if you have any sense of the relative importance of those sources yet.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We do. We have some of that isotope data for we can definitely share information about nitrate sources. I can definitely send you something like that. Off the top of my head, I'm not remember. I can't to give you like percentages, like 20% was fertilizer and this much, but definitely if you wanted to shoot me an email, we could. I can get you some numbers closer to that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I want to mention one more thing about this project. This is a TBERF funded project, and I definitely want to give props to Mary for taking the open science route and putting some of the data sets on a federated archive, so the Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity. This is our first TBERF project to do that, so some of the preliminary data from this project is openly accessible. So I just want to give kudos to Mary and her team for doing that.
Yeah, it's all archived. All of the nitrogen concentration, like in rainfall and stormwater runoff. So if you wanted information on just what are the concentrations of nitrogen and rainfall, it's all there. The isotope data that I was just talking about, that is there as well. So if you wanted to run like an isotope mixing model analysis and try to get some information about sources, which we are doing as well, but if you wanted to look at that yourself, you certainly could.
Yes, and just since it's been on the archive, it's been downloaded 59 times. So people are using the data.
I don't know how many of those were me, but yeah.
Those count too.
Hey Marcus, I have a quick question or comment for Mary and for the folks at TBEP. This is Brandon from Stantec, by the way. I think this is a great line of science here that is regionally relevant, well beyond our region, obviously. But I see a lot of future path for this as we have the fertilizer ordinance in place and everything that the Nitrogen Management Consortium has been working towards. But also, I see a lot of importance to get this in front of municipalities because St. Pete, Largo, many of our regional municipalities, as well as around the state and around the country, frankly, are looking at sustainability plans and regional resiliency plans, and those include transportation and greenhouse gas reduction and emission inventories, and being able to link or show links, hopefully, or at least pathways that you know, a lot of people, myself included, don't realize the links between atmospheric nitrogen and stormwater runoff. You think of, two different sources. Runoff is things that wash things from the land, but that baseline of nitrogen in that rainfall prior to even touching anything, the dog waste or the fertilizer or the lawn clippings, everything like that, and taking that further, looking at how, we're not going to reduce lightning, but we can, perhaps regionally look at transportation and mobility options when doing planning, and see how things like that could affect regional emissions and how that can trickle down. And for a lot of people, the value of looking at that is, how does that affect the bay? How does that affect my access to fishing, to enjoying the water, to red tide occurrence, to all of this? And I think it could be a really powerful tool in messaging and in getting some of the um, planners and elected officials to recognize the connectivity of a lot of this and the effects that can come from, you know, different sustainability and resiliency planning initiatives. So I think it's great what you're doing. I'm looking forward to seeing some more of these results. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate that feedback. And it's an argument that I've been making for years, is that, we really need to look at some of these other sources. And we're really seeing, quite a bit in the rainfall, just rainfall with before it has interacted with anything in the watershed, on the ground. And like you saw from that data, one of our highest Carina cell growth rate responses was from that 2-inch simulated rainfall event, which was taken from just rainfall samples. So, definitely. And we are working, so we're taking the data, now we're continuing to work on the data, but we're also working on a public outreach program. So up in the air, down in the water public outreach program, where we'll be having some community meetings and some education events just to educate the public and anyone else that we can, that there is that connection between the atmosphere and water quality, and absolutely those emissions, and both stationary and mobile, both of those emission sources are definitely something that are contributing to this problem. So yeah.
Yeah, that's outstanding. I love to hear that you're going to have those outreach events. So many people are looking for those opportunities. What can I do? Everything from, here with our infrastructure, not doing a load of laundry during a rain event, a heavy storm, so we don't have the infill and infiltration and issues, to, hey, ride your bike for many reasons, right? Just bringing it to that personal level. So thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Now we just got those bike lanes all over Tampa.
Mary, can I ask? You're planning on doing cultures again, but with field algae, and you mentioned that the Carenia is from the Gulf, but is the Pyrodinium, is that going to be from Old Tampa Bay?
So the field was just with Carina. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we just took advantage of that bloom that was out there, and
Any
right,
other
any
questions?
other questions?
If not, I guess it's safe to move on to our next presentation, which is an update on the CCMP. And I think that's going to be led by Jennifer Schaefer with some help from some others. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. Well, good morning, everybody. Jennifer Schaefer, Schaefer Consulting. Our firm was selected to assist the estuary program in updating the CCMP. And as you probably know, the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan, CCMP, this is the strategic plan for the Bay. It articulates Tampa Bay Estuary Program's goals, objectives, activities, and importantly, it coordinates partner activities for Tampa Bay conservation and restoration. So EPA mandates that all NEPs must have one of these, and they must contain certain elements. The last major revision of the CCMP rolled out in 2017, and it had previously been published as a printed book in 2006. The 2017 version was a digital PDF book. So in this CCMP update cycle, it is an update, not a full revision. We have been tasked with two mandates. First, to update the facts and figures for all the latest research projects and programs. So what's new in the last 5 years? And this includes an update to the research and monitoring priorities that Carrie's going to talk to you about in a moment. And it includes adding some new elements, including equity activities and climate adaptation activities. And Blake and Julie will speak to you about those respectively. There will also be staff activity to update the communication plan, the monitoring plan, and the funding plan. Our second mandate here was to make it easier to access and use the CCMP. As you may know, it is currently on the web as a digital PDF book, which is not very accessible in terms of updating it, in terms of quickly finding the information that staff and partners need. So we will be implementing the new CCMP in a modular web format with all of the source files housed on GitHub. And this will make it much easier to update during intervening years. And it'll live on the Tampa Bay Estuary Program's website, much like the State of the Bay reports. So that's kind of an overview of what we're up to. We kicked off in January, and we hope to have all of this completed and approved by the fall. So let me turn it over to Carrie, and she can take it from there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks.
Perfect.
All right. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to update you all on how we're doing as far as assessing the research and monitoring priorities that are linked with our CCMP plan. And at the last TAC meeting, we sent out a survey link and asked everyone on the technical advisory committee to take a look at it, look at our current research and monitoring priorities, and see if we need to update them for the future. So I'm going to show a little bit of results from that survey, and then talk about next steps as far as how we're going to revise these research and monitoring priorities. So as I'm going through this, if you all want to add input, please put it in the chat, or raise your hand. This can be kind of an interactive process. So I'll go ahead and get started. So our, let's see. There we go. Okay. So like I said, we asked for your input on the current research and monitoring priorities. And some of the things that we wanted you to do was we wanted you to look at each individual priority, which was listed in the survey. And we asked you if each priority, to assign it basically a value. Should we retire that priority? Have we already achieved it? Should we revise it? Maybe it's not, maybe it's not worded in the correct way on, how we need to address that particular priority, or if we just want to retain it as is. We also put together a reference table that was linked within the survey so that you could look at each priority, and we had specific projects that we had done towards that research and monitoring priority, just so that you guys knew what progress we've actually made on that. And then we also separated the priorities into topics just to make it a little bit easier, especially if you have a particular expertise. You could go to the water quality and sediment quality area. If that's your expertise, you can comment on that, maybe just put not applicable for the other sections. So the importance of the research and monitoring priorities in the CCMP is that they guide our work. They identify the data gaps in the watershed, and they can be used to prioritize and plan for our planning and for funding. So when our partners like you on the TAC are involved, it's a win-win. So we're aware of some of the data gaps that are in the watershed, and also the capacity, what type of researchers can actually address those data gaps. So we want to have this, kind of interaction between, what the research priorities are and, if we can actually address them. So that way we can be more efficient with the funds that we can make available. So the survey was open for 1 month. We opened it on the day of the last TAC meeting and closed it in February. And, I put a general kind of response rate based on the number of folks that signed into the TAC meeting in January. So we got 29 responses, but that's actually about a 30% response rate based on 98 people that tuned in. We also sent the survey out to the entire listserv for the TAC, which is over 600. So if you calculate it that way, then it's about maybe a 5% response rate. So even though it sounds like it's a small amount of responses, we're actually getting some good data there. Overall, most of the priorities were designated retained. So, we can go ahead and keep those within the CCMP. And then, as I was going through the survey data, there were about 10 priorities that had greater than 5 responses, or about 20% of the folks that said that the priorities should either be retired or revised. So I'm going to go through those 10 priorities, and we could talk about them. And if you have any suggestions on how they should be revised, or, if you have strong feelings whether they should be retired, please let us know. So I'll go ahead and get into the first one. So our first priority that had greater than 6 responses for retire, revise was to better quantify fertilizer use and potential reductions in nitrogen loadings. And most of the folks said that this should be revised. And, as I go through this, I'm actually going to read out some of the particular, individual comments so that you guys can get a better idea on why folks designated these as revise or retire. One of the comments was the impacts are already fairly well quantified and the potential for significant change is limited. Another comment had to do with, regarding reducing fertilizer and nitrogen loadings. This went poorly due to the unforeseen intensity of opposition. So there's that issue. Another was, recommending that we revisit the thresholds regarding the effects on estuarine habitats resulting from increased residential development and population growth. There were actually some suggestions as well to consider potentially dry season fertilizer bans for waterfront properties, treating reclaimed water more, and then, putting more homeowner education within this priority. Ooh, hold on. Okay. I did want to make a few notes. Ed wanted me to communicate that we will be collaborating with the Ocean Conservancy on a new nitrogen source tracking this year. And also, the EPA and some partners may have some questions on the effectiveness of existing ordinances. So we may want to do some targeted studies to evaluate some of the behavior change campaigns that we have in place, such as Bee Floridian. So this is so basically this is how I'll go through all these 10 priorities. I'll put it up there, I'll read some comments, and then, ask for your input. So, if you have anything, just put it in the chat. And if you don't, I'll just keep moving on. And if you have questions or additions afterwards, you can reach out to us. So this was our first. Yes.
Can I just chime in, Carrie? This is a great opportunity for those who might have some suggestions on how we can revise some of these actions so that they are more actionable. This would be a really great time to kind of discuss that so that we can get a better idea of how you think we should revise these.
Thanks, Sheila. And that's kind of the idea. Those that we want to thank, first of all, the folks that spent all this time responding to this survey and putting in these detailed comments. But if we are going to revise these priorities, we do need a little bit of guidance on how it will be more effective for you and like Sheila said, more actionable. So, so the one that we're looking at now is better quantify fertilizer use and potential reductions in nitrogen loading. So anything that can be changed to make that more clear is useful. I'll go ahead and just leave.
I'll pull a Maya card and just remind you that if we don't have a lot of conversation and discussion around this, Maya will threaten to have these in person again.
I'm going to go ahead and leave these up for 30 seconds or so, and then I'll move on to the next one. So if you need to think about this, obviously, okay, so I've got a comment from Natasha that says, I used the Bee Floridian campaign. Thank you. So that's good. So do you think maybe that potentially we should be concentrating on educational campaigns when it comes to this, and maybe add that into the revision? All right. So I'll go ahead and go to the next one. And like I said, this presentation is going to be available, and also at the very end of the presentation, we will have a space. We will have a space for folks to add additional research and monitoring priorities as well. Okay, so the second water and sediment quality priority that had over 6 revision or retire recommendations was to better understand the causes of sewer and sanitary overflows. And a lot of the comments on this one had to do with since the advent of required state reporting, most public utilities have a good idea on the causes of SSOs. And so in many cases, they're already implementing some smart technologies like smart manholes. Most of those comments had to do with that. And we typically know why these overflows happen. One of the responses was to potentially concentrate on preventative measures and education. And we actually agree on this recommendation that, this should be revised based on some of the comments. So our recommendation our recommendation would be to actually revise this and potentially add in those preventative measures in education. And it looks like we've got some agreement there in the chat, which is great. Does anybody have any other thoughts on sanitary sewer overflows and how we can revise this priority? Awesome. We're having a lot of nice comments in the chat, so we're going to capture those. So Jennifer said, for the previous priority, exploring revising local urban fertilizer ordinance to require point of sale signage. We got some agreement on the SSOs, education for informed advocacy, educate folks on the amount of nitrogen limit or reclaim water, right? Frequency of fertilizing their lawns. Yeah, all of these. Great. Yeah, that's what I want. So if you guys don't want to speak up, please just put it in the chat and it'll be recorded and we'll be able to incorporate that into our revisions. Yeah, I'll leave this up for a couple more seconds, then I'll move on. Oh, maybe my presentation will move on by itself. Okay. Okay. So the next one, the next priority that had a lot of revise or retire designations was evaluating new on-site disposal system technologies and the effectiveness of those technologies. And we didn't have a lot of input on this. It just, we had one comment that says recommending retiring this. So, you know, if anyone has any recommendations for revising or retiring this particular priority, we'd love to hear your, love to hear your thoughts on that. And again, I know some of these research and monitoring priorities may not be in your area of expertise, and that's fine too. So we're only showing responses for folks that felt comfortable answering some of these.
What technologies are they specifically referring to here?
Well, so that's a good question. I was researching it myself because I'm a little new to the to this particular type of research and monitoring priorities. So I would love if someone that had more knowledge on that. I believe that this has to do with septic systems, but please correct me if I'm wrong. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. The next one is on bay habitats. So we've moved on from water quality and sediment quality. And bay habitats, this one was not recommended for retiring, which is good. But it was recommended for revision. And the research and monitoring priority is identify causes of seagrass recovery slowdown or seagrass loss in problem areas, representing at least 10% of a bay segment. And this is very topical right now, considering the recent seagrass losses. This was recommended for revision. And some of the related comments here had to do with differences in seagrass sustainability with the changing climate, and that this needs to be included in any effort to examine causes. And then there were several comments regarding, you know, maybe we need to emphasize seagrass less as an indicator and more as on the habitat as a whole. So is seagrass due to a specific source? Is it habitat migration, natural or otherwise? And is it reasonable to expect it to return? You know, and is it a problem if it's gone? So there's definitely some interesting comments here, and it sounds like there's a difference in opinion in the amount of seagrass coverage that the bay can sustain and support. So this may lead to a larger conversation within the TAC with maybe several presentations having to do with this. So, for example, is there a majority of stakeholders that think that our level of 40,000 acres is too high? Um, uh, but anyway, this one was also recommended for revision, so we may need to think about this a little bit more and get back to it at a further time. Are there any thoughts on this? And thoughts on how we should revise this to make it more pertinent to our CCMP goals? Okay. All right. It looks like we're getting a lot of messages in the chat. If I could have, let's see. It says, are most seagrass reductions being outcompeted by algae species or just a loss of area? That's a good point. And then there's also been some comments in the chat based on those previous monitoring priorities. So thank you for adding those in.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention in reference to Natasha's comment, I mean, that's an area of research that's actively being pursued right now. The trade-offs between macroalgae and seagrass change, what that means in terms of nutrient cycling and differing habitat benefits. We're definitely concerned about that and don't foresee backing off that question or research need anytime soon.
All right, I'm going to let everybody keep their thinking caps on for a little bit on that, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next research and monitoring priority. Again, just keep these in your head, and if you have thoughts, throw them in the chat or get with us later. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to kind of an easy one. So this research and monitoring priority was to develop a best management practices document for coastal habitat restoration in Tampa Bay. And you can see here that a lot of folks said retire, and those are probably folks that are familiar with the BMP manual that we published in 2020. And there's some that said revise. There was also a recommendation that we put a time frame on when we revise this document, say every 5 to 10 years. But our recommendation for this one is to retire, just because we did do what we said on this particular research and monitoring priority, and potentially add a time frame for revising this manual. So oh, thank you. And Marcus actually put the link to the best management practices document in the chat, so you can go check it out for yourself if you would like. And if we don't have any comments on that in the next, 10 seconds or so, I'll go ahead and move on in the interest of time. Okay, we've got one comment for agree with setting a review period. And again, we're still getting comments on seagrass and also in, for the nitrogen research and monitoring priorities. So thank you again for adding those into the chat. Okay, so for our next research and monitoring priority that has to do with bay habitats, this one was to better understand how coastal development impacts habitat function. And there were a lot of suggestions to revise this particular priority. And some of the comments related to this had to do with how some of this priority is being addressed through federal permitting. So there were a couple comments, it looks like, from some of our NOAA partners that said that this is important and managed and accomplished through National Marine Fisheries Service staff. Mark, would you like to comment on that since you got your...
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Carrie?
I can. Thank you
And
for
everybody?
commenting.
Certainly, no problem. And again, appreciate the opportunity to both review all of the priorities and chime in right now. Um, on this, I mean, again, I've kind of volunteered, I feel like, because my daily 9 to 5 work is predominantly looking at activities which would adversely affect different Tampa Bay habitats. And keep in mind, my area of responsibility is the Everglades over to Pensacola Bay. So even though Tampa Bay's in my backyard, I do serve throughout the Florida Gulf Coast. And I put this in there about potentially, removing it, if you will, because number one, this is something that I'm always doing. And honestly, I'll defer to the TAC whether or not it looks like the majority would like to either refine or retain it. Um, so I felt like this is something that I'm doing anyway. If there are other priorities that I think the TAC would rather focus on, rest assured that this is my typical responsibility and that I will keep, the estuary program and the TAC apprised of any types of activities. And apologies on the background noise.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for clarifying. Is there any other discussion on this particular priority? There was another comment within the survey that basically said, we need to have more emphasis on how development affects habitat function, and then, mentioned specifically that the ship wake studies were a great starting point, but that grandfathering of development needs to be assessed and potentially revised. So that was one other comment that was in the survey. All right, so we do have one recommendation for retire on this one. The others are revised. So again, if you have suggestions on how to revise these priorities, please let us know. Okay, our next priority was reevaluating the restore the balance paradigm for habitat restoration. And this is another one where there were a lot of votes for retire, and that's based on the publication of our Habitat Master Plan update in 2020, where this particular paradigm was addressed, and now we're looking at maximizing the potential instead. So we recommend that this is retired since we did shift that paradigm to a different one. And let me see if there were any additional comments on this one. Yeah, there were 5 that specifically had comments that the Habitat Master Plan is complete. There were a couple of comments having to do with consolidating some of these products, and I'm assuming that this means the Habitat Master Plan and also the Best Management Practices document, and kind of fold these tools together to encourage habitat protection and restoration efforts publicly and privately. And then also there was a comment that restore the balance won't work in the face of mangrove expansion on salt marshes as a result of sea level rise and lack of cold events in the winter, which we know, with mangrove expansion that is happening. So I think we've addressed this research and monitoring priority. So, unless anyone disagrees, we're planning on retiring that one as well. Okay, so the next one, this one, there were several that recommended retiring or revising our research and monitoring priority for conducting early life history studies of Gulf of Mexico priority fishery species. And the reasoning behind this is different than what you might think. It sounds like most folks consider that this priority is being addressed pretty heavily by research efforts by FWI and others. And maybe this isn't something that we really need to prioritize because it's already being done by by other groups, but these are our partner groups. So, this obviously is a research priority that is important. And as a fisheries biologist, of course, I'll always think that this is important. There was also a comment to focus on protecting what species are here and potentially incorporating that into the bay habitats section. So, a couple of different comments on this. And maybe we revise this in a way that we support our partners that are doing this research. So if there's any input on this, I'd love to hear it as well.
Hey, Carrie, it's Brandon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on the revision suggestion for this, as well as a lot of the other ones as well, um, I understand the idea of retiring the priority kind of as is, but keeping some link to the policy. And this is a good example. If we retain or continue to have any habitat priority with the estuary program, I think you certainly need some link to species. That is a function of habitat. So
Yeah.
I absolutely get that FWC and others universities are conducting species level and fishery level research, much more rigorously, and perhaps that's not the direction or the priority for the estuary program, but the concept of maintaining a linkage to the fishery and species aspect, whether it's on the fishery level or T&E, links to seagrass, to manatees, everything like that. I think there has to be some linkage there as a goal or a priority for the estuary program. So I don't have your exact language on the revision, but I agree that it's maybe a clarification through revision for the priority, how the language is aimed to show that reliance on partner organizations for maybe the on the ground research, but being able to associate the fisheries response with habitat priorities, perhaps for habitat restoration priorities. So just my comment on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And remember that, these are the research priorities. So, all of these other, the CCMP involves several actions and several sections within each action with activities, so there's still a whole fish and wildlife, part of the CCMP that will still be in place. This is just, basically trying to figure out what type of priorities we want to keep in, as far as our goal in the current stage of how we're doing our research. So yeah, and just a general comment, within the survey we did get comments, but we didn't get specific revisions. So we got, hey, maybe you should look at it this way, but there weren't a lot of specific, like, well, I would revise it as this. So that's kind of what this is all about. I picked out the 10 that had the most, the 10 priorities that had the most responses that said, hey, we should revise this or we should retire this. So, this is a chance for folks to say, hey, I agree with that. I don't agree with that. And if I do agree with that, this is how I would revise it. So that's kind of what we're looking for. And there is a comment here that says, by Bill, says supporting early life history studies as a priority may influence the availability of future funding for our partners. And that's true. So, these are things that we should be discussing. So So I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. And this had to do with improving invasive species monitoring. And there weren't a lot of suggestions on this one either. There weren't any real comments, but we did have several that said revise and then a few that said retire. So just a couple of notes here. Some of this work has been performed by the Suncoast CISMA, but we're not sure how active they've been lately. We can suggest probably supporting and renewing citizen-based monitoring when it comes to invasive species. There's also a large database that's maintained by the USGS that does cover our area that we could potentially use to look at monitoring for invasive species. So there's a couple of options here. So, you know, maybe just a clarification on how we're going to improve these invasive species monitoring methods would be useful. So if anybody that had those comments wanted to kind of elaborate on, you know, how they thought that this could be revised to be more effective, that would be useful. Okay, there we go. Okay, we have a question here. It says, does the CCMP want to target specific species or be more general? It's a good question. Related to invasives. Got it. I don't think so. I mean, you know, in particular, we're just looking at, you know, any types of invasives that are moving into the estuary and how we can monitor that progress. So it could be fish, it could be, you know, like it's listed here, pythons, tegu, other things. You know, we want to know when these species are moving into the watershed. And the best way to do that is to have some sort of consistent monitoring. All right, again, if anybody has suggested revisions, we are looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, and then finally, the last priority had to do with climate change. And this one, again, was one that wasn't recommended to be retired. But there were several votes for revising this particular research and monitoring priority. So the priority is to better understand the factors contributing to harmful algal blooms and problem species that may come in the future due to changing climate. So some of the comments related to that had to do, you know, in a constantly changing ecology, we need to evaluate changes in light of impacts and overall functionality of the ecosystem. This also links back to some of the comments on seagrass loss. And, you know, this particular commenter said that they still hear a lot of discussion that indicate paradigms have retained the past in place of what does this mean for the bay, particular for seagrass and macroalgae and habitat composition. So some of that has kind of been addressed with our new habitat master plan, but again, with the changing climate, we are going to have to, you know, continually reassess that. And then climate change topics are highly important, and, you know, basically these two comments have to do with keep the emerging information and actions attuned to what the experts in manatees managers are learning. So these actions on climate change are likely to encompass many other topics as areas of study. So these are all going to be somewhat related. So again, if there's any suggestions on how to revise this so that we can add that in, you know, I would say probably we would just add on something, you know, as far as, you know, constantly evaluate through changes in climate, you know, for each one of these. Okay, so those are the 10 research and monitoring priorities that we would like your input on. Please take your time going back on them, and feel free to speak up, put things in the TAC. are in the chat. And in addition to this, so we sent this out so that you could evaluate what we have currently, but times change and there are additional research and monitoring priorities that we would like to consider including. So in order to do that, we're actually in the process of putting a survey out to colleges and universities that study within the watershed to see what students and professors at those universities think might be emerging topics of research. And our intern, Olivia, is actually spearheading that. So if you get an email from her with a survey for university folks, please fill that out. And then again, we would like TAC input on this as well. So if there are additional research and monitoring priorities that you think we should address on top of what's already there that we'll be retaining, you can talk about them now if you like, or you can put them in the chat, or we put the same version that we're a similar version to what we're sending to the colleges and universities. We're also putting a survey there. So if you want to think about it and add any suggestions for additional research and monitoring priorities, you can add them there. And there's a link to the survey here. If someone wouldn't mind putting that in the chat from our TBEP side, you can go ahead and add your research and monitoring priorities to that survey. So the idea is to revise these priorities by the next TAC meeting and add some additional ones into the mix, and then bring it back to you guys at the next TAC meeting for discussion and approval. So again, if you have any input, we'd love to hear it. Again, this is a win-win. If we have the research and monitoring priorities in there that you guys are able to address, then we'll be able to more effectively use our funding. Thanks. Thanks, Sheila. The survey is now in the chat if you'd like to just add your additional research and monitoring priorities there as well. I think everyone needs more coffee. All right, well, if there are no more, let's see. Got a couple of comments about invasives, python population. Yeah. Looks like there's a couple comments in here that say that we need to keep that invasive species research and monitoring priority. So thank you for that.
And just FYI, we do keep the chat log for all of our TAC meetings. So if it's in the chat, we have it documented.
Yeah, I know there were a lot of comments in here, so thank you so much for putting that in there. I didn't read them all out, but we will take them into consideration when we're revising these priorities. So thank you very much. All right, well, I'll go ahead and give it to, I think Blake is up next. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's see. Can everyone see this? Are you seeing it in the Windows screen, or are you seeing the full version?
Full
We
version.
see presenter screen.
Okay. So great. As Jennifer mentioned, one of our updates to the CCMP is the development of a new equity strategy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this, just give kind of a general overview, but really sort of the key thing that we're looking for feedback on is how we are going to actually measure or identify the communities of interest that would apply to this equity strategy. And I just wanted to let you all know that we do have a GitHub web page that's currently up. It gives you an overview basically of what I'm going to be talking about today. It actually even gives you more detailed information than what I'm going to cover just in this next 20 minutes or so. Sheila, if you can put this link here in the chat if people want to go and visit it. This kind of gives you an overview of the equity strategy and our current thinking of how we would approach this methodologically for identifying disadvantaged or underserved communities to prioritize for TBEP's future activities. All of this is going to read very much like this is what we're doing, but it's still very much a working draft. This is just a place for us to put in our current thoughts on what we are proposing to do. So have a look through it, while I'm chatting or afterwards to get yourself familiar with it or to see more of the interactive components. There is a bunch of R code there so that people can replicate it if you want to go through those steps as well. But one thing that I wanted to do before I really sort of do a deep dive in this is just making sure that everyone's on the same page about what we are talking about when we talk about equity, because a lot of people have sort of different interpretations. Indeed, the EPA's definition of equity is different from what I would teach whenever I teach classes about equity and social equity and conservation. So just to get everybody on the same page at the very basic level, there's three different terminologies that can sort of get kind of mixed in the dialogue. We have equality, and equality is really about equal opportunity for everyone. So everyone has the same sort of means at their disposal to get to an outcome. Equity is different because equity is focused on the actual outcome. So making sure that everybody gets to the same end, regardless of the means to get there. And then when we talk about justice, so when you hear things like environmental justice, this is about removing systemic barriers that create that inequity in the first place. And you've probably seen a lot of different versions of the figure here. This just gives you an example of what equality means. So it's the same opportunity provided to everybody, the same, resources provided to everyone. But when we think about equity, there's a difference here because some people, that same opportunity is not going to give them the same outcome. So some people are going to need more resources or less resources just based off of their sort of, inherent state or historical legacies that have put them at a, quote unquote disadvantage. And then an example of justice is where you remove that barrier that leads to that inequitable outcome. And so we'll be focusing on equity in our discussions today. And a lot of people don't know the different types of equity that are out there. There are, generally speaking, three types. So the first one that most people will know about and they think about when they think about equity is what we call distributive equity. So this is who is bearing the costs or the burdens or benefiting or receiving the rewards from a particular intervention. So how are those pros and cons distributed within a society? Procedural equity is a bit different. It's about who has a seat at the table, whose voices are being heard, who is involved in consultations and the decision-making process. So it's about, who gets a seat at the table and how diverse and inclusive that is. And then last is recognitional equity. And so this is about, the final outcome that you produce, the intervention you have, how reflective is it of the different values, needs, identities, or knowledge of the actual people in that community. And a lot of studies have been done that show, most people, especially in conservation, they're focused on distributive equity and much less so focused on procedural and especially recognitional equity. And so I just wanted to get you all to start thinking about how we are defining equity and that there are different types. And what the research shows us is that a lot of times, if you only focus on one aspect of equity, you kind of don't really end up with a completely equitable end product. And so it's just to get you thinking about different types of equity that there are and how we might be able to address multiple types of equity in our planning decisions. But with that said, our equity strategy, hopefully some of you have heard about this. So I just started at TBEP back in January. So I think in past TAC meetings, you guys have probably talked about the bipartisan infrastructure law and TBEP's strategies or initial strategies going on. So I'll just give a quick overview of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So this is giving about $900,000 in annual funding to each NEP during the period of 2022 to 2026. And our policy board has previously approved projects receiving bill funding focusing on tidal tributary restoration and wastewater infrastructure resilience projects. And so what we want to do is have for our equity strategy, we want to make sure that the projects funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law are going to deliver equitable and fair access to the benefits of those projects for all the communities out there. And the EPA has a national target saying at least 40% of the benefits from those bill-funded projects need to flow to what they consider disadvantaged communities for all NEPs. And so some NEPs, they might have, 30%, maybe some are going to have 50% or higher, but just across the board for all the NEPs, it needs to come out to about 40%. And just to sort of emphasize here this definition, this target that EPA has, this is a measure of distributive equity only. So it doesn't account for the other types of equity. And so this is just, guidance from EPA. There is some flexibility that we have when adopting our own equity strategy. And this is because the EPA recognizes, we might need to tailor things specifically to our contexts or who our communities are and what the problems are and those sorts of things. So before I really sort of get into things, I just wanted to give you all a heads up of the things that I would like to have us discuss as a group. And so you can have these sort of percolate and you can think about them as I go through the presentation. But one of the things that we want to think about is, should we adopt the EPA's definition of disadvantaged communities, or do we want to adopt an alternative, something like underserved and overburdened communities? When we think about that target, so that 40% distributive equity target, do we want to adopt that target specifically within Tampa Bay, or do we want to set a different target for ourselves? And do we want to expand that so it's not just a distributive equity target, but maybe a recognitional equity target or a procedural equity target? And for those targets, do we want to focus that just on projects that are funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law? Do we want it to apply to all the projects that we have, the research, the habitat, education, outreach, all of those projects, or is it just some different combination of those that we want this equity target to apply to? And then the major thing that I want to hear feedback from is specifically about what methodology we should use to actually identify those disadvantaged communities, because that's going to form the foundation of all of our reporting and our metrics and things like that. So that is what's going to be the focus of today. But all of these questions here, please feel free at any time, pop them in the chat, or we'll come back to them at the end to talk about and hear your thoughts on. So, as I mentioned, the foundation, who is going to be considered a disadvantaged community for our tracking purposes? So the EPA uses the term disadvantaged to describe communities that are facing hardship or who have historically benefited unevenly from federal funds. And this term disadvantaged can be a bit contentious. So there are some communities and organizations out there that don't like this word. So we are considering a potential alternative term that is a bit less divisive, and that would be underserved. And so potential advantage of that in terms of, being less controversial, more approachable for some people, but also, a bit reflective on, where, services provided in the past rather than kind of describing a community as they are right now and saying that they're disadvantaged. Another important thing to think about here is that this is explicitly distinct from what we would call environmental justice communities. And so, a disadvantaged or an underserved community oftentimes is also an environmental justice community. So there are, environmental inequities, pollution, what have you, that those communities face. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every disadvantaged community is also going to be associated with environmental justice issues. So just keeping in mind that those are distinct terms, but there will inevitably be some overlap in there. And for on the EPA side, the way that they identify disadvantaged is using what they have called the Environmental Justice Screening Tool, or EJ Screen. If you want to learn more about that, you can play around with it. But basically, what they recommend to all the NAPs, we don't have to follow it per se, but what they recommend is using their supplemental demographic index. And what they do is this index takes the average of 5 different demographic variables tracked at the census block group nationally. And this includes the percent of the block that's classified as low income, the percent that is unemployed, percent with low life expectancy, percent that's linguistically isolated, so limited English speaking, and the percent without a high school education. And so they take those for every single census block, they take an average, and then they estimate the national percentile that each census block group falls under. And then what they do with that is they determined that, okay, every census block group that scores in the 80th percentile or higher nationally is going to be considered a disadvantaged community. And so for what that looks like for Tampa Bay, here you can see for all of the census block groups in our watershed, the percentile that they fall under this supplemental demographic index score. So you can see there's a lot of variation that we have throughout our watershed. What that then translates to, if we just look at that 80th percentile threshold, is that these are the communities that the EPA would define in our watershed as a disadvantaged community. And so, you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but we have, places of East Tampa, Ybor, we also have Lealman and South St. Pete, Bradenton, but even places like Waimama. We've got some Plant City, even some Zephyr Hills up here in the mix. So this gives us a little bit of an idea of what the EPA would consider disadvantaged communities. For us, though, at least from our end, is we're not, a huge fan of that supplemental demographic index where it sort of averages across all 5 of those characteristics. We feel like that's a bit of an exclusive criteria, right? So what if, a community is both low income with high unemployment, but isn't, exceptionally high in all the other things? They are going to get left out based on that equation. And so we have proposed an alternative for identifying underserved communities. And that basically just means using those same 5 demographic variables, which census tracts have at least 2 out of the 5 meeting that 80% threshold. So, This helps us get rid of, that need to say you don't have enough disadvantages, right, to be considered an underserved community. But it also excludes, places that might meet one of the criteria. So especially, areas of wealthy retirees, they're going to score highly in unemployment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in reality, an underserved community. So this is our proposed kind of change to what the EPA considers disadvantaged. We also are proposing going a step further and incorporating environmental justice into the picture by characterizing what environmental justice issues those underserved communities are facing, and identifying what we're calling overburdened communities. And so this would give us an opportunity to say, hey, if we're thinking about, tidal tributary restoration, or if we're thinking of wastewater infrastructure, let's go into those, underserved communities and find out which ones could really sort of benefit from alleviating some of those specific wastewater related issues, or a lack of green space, other sorts of things that can really help us tailor our strategies towards the communities and the challenges they're facing. So if we take our proposed approach into the mix, here you can see at the census tract level the number of those demographic thresholds that are met in each of the census tracts. And see, it looks a little bit similar, but it's not quite as much variation that we saw from the EPA's version. And based on our proposed definition of having at least 2 or more of those thresholds met, this is what we are proposing be the map of our underserved communities here in Tampa Bay. And if you're wondering how this compares to what the EPA said, you can see there's a lot of overlap. It's very similar. There are some differences. Ours, again, is a little bit more inclusive, so we often tend to have more communities or a wider spread of communities than what the EPA considers, but also the EPA looks at census blocks, which is a much smaller scale resolution. And so they might have a few other things kind of pop up that we don't grab at the broader census tract level. But for the most part, we feel relatively comfortable with our proposed method because it is still very similar to what the EPA gets with their supplemental demographic index. And this is just one way that we can map those underserved communities. So, for those that maybe, are focused on environmental priorities and looking at the landscape from more of an environmental or hydrological perspective, we have other ways that we can create this map. So this map here is just translating this map of, census tracts that are underserved into something that might be a bit more relevant for people that are working in different, for around different water bodies. So this shows for all the drainage basins in our watershed, the percent of their terrestrial area that is covered by an underserved community that's in here. And so, if you've got a project that's in Salt Creek or, wherever, you can go and see, okay, we've got about 40 to 60% or whatever is considered an underserved community. So this might actually be a really good candidate for some of the activities that we want to do. So this is just another way to show how we might go about mapping these different communities in different ways that it can be useful for us. And then that last kind of second piece that we're proposing adding on is about identifying the communities that are both underserved but also overburdened by different environmental justice issues. And so for this case, we're taking kind of the same approach. We're looking at 12 different environmental justice issues and which census tracts score in the 80th percentile or higher nationally for those different issues. I'm just going to do a quick run through of what those issues are that we're considering. But Sheila, you can pop in the chat the link to CGEST. So 10 of these come from the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool that the White House uses. And so if you want to learn more about exactly how they're measured and where the data comes from, you can check out that link. But we've got environmental justice issues about climate change, specifically predicted agricultural loss and flood risk under climate change, nature deprivation, so a lack of green space, air pollution, this is particulate matter concentrations, traffic volume and proximity to high traffic areas, water pollution, sites of high wastewater discharge, a suite of other pollution measures, things like proximity to hazardous waste facilities, to brownfield sites and phosphate mines, and as well as legacy effects. So historic underinvestment of the census tracts from historic redlining and things like that. And all of these have been selected because we think that they are relevant to the Tampa Bay communities, but they're also things that TBEP activities could help to mitigate. And so ideally we want to be able to identify which of these underserved communities are also facing different burdens when we think about environmental justice issues. And this shows you for all of those underserved communities that we've identified, the number of burdens thresholds that they meet. So again, you can see, the sort of East Tampa Ybor area has a lot of environmental burdens in those areas. But also, there's only 3 underserved communities, particularly right here, if you can see where my mouse is. We only have 3 out of, I think it's 166 or so communities in here that are underserved but not overburdened. So as I mentioned earlier, while underserved and overburdened communities don't mean the same thing, and sometimes there isn't overlap. In our case, there's almost a complete overlap. Almost every single one of our underserved communities are also overburdened by one or more of these environmental justice issues. And we can use this information to tease out different burdens that our different activities might be able to help alleviate for those communities. So, we can identify, if we've got a project that can help reduce flood risk, we can say, okay, which underserved communities could really benefit from flood risk reduction? If we're thinking about green space, parks, those types of things, reducing impervious surfaces, these are the communities that could really benefit from some of our activities. And also wastewater discharge. So thinking about more resilient wastewater infrastructure, here are some really good candidates for underserved communities that could benefit from alleviating those issues in that community. And then lastly, if you're wondering just, how are we going to report on this? How does this all turn into a number? This is an example of how the EPA is applying the approach nationally. And so they've created a 2017 to 2021 baseline for TBEP. And so they are specifically just looking at habitat projects. We are going to go further than that, right? So I mentioned, we've got other projects. We've got outreach and education projects that we also think should be included in our equity strategy. But so they have identified habitat projects within their definition of disadvantaged communities. And you can see sort of how that tracks across different measures of distributive equity. So the percent of all habitat projects that were in disadvantaged communities, the percent of Section 320 funds that were invested in those communities, and overall, for all projects, the total costs annually that were invested in disadvantaged communities. But we are also proposing taking that a little bit further and saying it doesn't necessarily have to occur within a particular disadvantaged or underserved community. We also say, hey, there's flow-on benefits for communities that are adjacent to these things. And some projects are really large, right? So having just like one single point isn't reflective of the broader benefits. So if we extend this to our projects within 1 mile of those communities, you can see that we get a noticeable increase. In some years, we actually meet that 40% target, or even higher, depending on which measure of equity you want to look at. And just overall total, you can see that about 28% of all of our projects were within 1 mile of disadvantaged communities over the last 5 years for at least our habitat projects. So all of that said, that's a lot of information. Again, you can go to the website and you can find more information. But now I want to open it up, the floor, to feedback from all of you. Definitely let me know if you have strong feelings about our methodology. Do you like our proposed method for identifying underserved and overburdened communities, or do you prefer us going with the EPA's version, or do you have an entirely different approach that you think would be most relevant to our watershed? But also, if you have strong opinions about any of the other ideas, so just what term should we use, what numerical target should we establish, what types of equity should those targets apply to, and do we want to do this just for bill-funded projects or all of our projects, a subset of our projects? This is your time to give us valuable feedback for that. And so I'll open the floor. I don't know where the comments are, so I can't really see them. But if people want to either read the comments to me, or if people want to shout.
So we had a comment from Brandon, and he said, to meet the intent of elevating disadvantaged / underserved, etc. priorities, TBEP will have to develop a definition beyond economic metrics, as a majority of coastal areas in our region, which are by definition a focus of TBEP, are dominated by communities with higher economic basis. On the flip side, TBEP may need to reevaluate priorities further inland, which based on a watershed view, are certainly within the program scope. And Brandon, you can unmute if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that is an important question. Is we need to come up with a methodology for identifying these communities that is reproducible and objective, certainly, but is also based on subjective knowledge, right? It's not just a blanket, every community everywhere in the US is going to be considered the same definition. And so, so we're definitely open to more thoughts, going beyond these sociodemographic characteristics of disadvantage, and thinking about, how could we still have something that is reproducible with, good data that's available to the public, but, how can we best tailor it to define, what the communities that are in Tampa Bay.
There is one hand up in the chat. Jonah from Plant City.
Hi, Jonah.
Hi, Blake. Thanks for this presentation. I really like your approach. I think you're kind of on the right track. I just was going to ask you if you could speak to how you plan to address the inherent inequity of this group unilaterally deciding what this definition should be without consulting any of those communities. I know you have a plan. I'm sure you do. I just was hoping you could help us understand that a little better.
So we do have a plan, and so that's another aspect that Jennifer and our consultants are working on. So we are currently in the process of reaching out to stakeholders throughout the community within these, especially within communities that we have sort of already flagged as potentially meeting our underserved definition. And so we do have a process going on right now of stakeholder elicitation, consultation, and feedback. We are going to have, as part of the equity strategy, there is a section that is all about how we are going to go about with stakeholder engagement and with sort of, reflexive feedback type of stuff, right? Because one of the big things about equity in practice is talking about, who gets to define what is an equitable outcome. And, so it's a long lecture that I would give to my students, but a short version is even just thinking about, if you are in a room with diverse, communities, and you say, okay, we're going to give this community a larger slice of the pie. But if that community doesn't feel that that slice of pie is large enough, you are still going to end up with an inequitable outcome, because really the only people who can say what they think is an equitable outcome are the people who are getting the benefits, right? So all of this is a little bit, all of the stuff that I've presented today. It's really just the foundational stuff. How do we determine what is a underserved community so that we can, create and build the rest of this platform that then says, okay, this is going to be, our stakeholders that we consult across the watershed. This is going to be our process for, communicating with them, involving them in decisions, and getting feedback from them on what they want, and those sorts of things. So yeah, it's very much kind of a tiered approach, and this is really just that, base foundational component to the equity strategy.
One more quick question from Kira, who has her hand raised, and then I think we're going to be pushing right up against time, so we need to move on to the next presentation.
Hey there. Yeah, I was just curious if there was like examples or other models to your approach to coming up with this definition. And then when you were hoping to have all of our feedback on this, is it for the next meeting or yeah?
Yeah. So in terms of other models, the only real sort of model that's currently out there right now is just the EPA's recommendation and what they're doing nationally. But again, they're kind of viewing it from a lens of how, what is like a nationally harmonized way that we can compare all of the NEPs exactly the same. So there is some tailoring that we can do for our specific area. As far as I'm aware, other NEPs are not this far along in the development of their methodology. We've talked to some that currently have plans for doing their own methodology, which is a bit sort of different and even more tailored to their specific area. But other than that, we don't really have kind of a baseline model to go off of, other than what the EPA has already suggested. And yeah, if people want to give this some thought, you can view this presentation after this asynchronously, and you can also send me an email if you have thoughts on this. Ideally, having it in the next month would be great. I can send out an email just to prompt everyone as a reminder, and for those people who couldn't make it today, to please give feedback on any of these.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks, Blake. We will move on to Julie Morris, who is going to update us on climate adaptation planning as part of the CCMP.
Good morning. Hope you can hear me. Some of you may remember that in 2016 and 17, some members of the TAC and folks from the Agency on Bay Management and the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel worked together on a climate vulnerability assessment for Tampa Bay. This process identified ways that the goals of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program are vulnerable to climate stressors: sea level rise, warmer water and air, increased storminess, increased nitrogen, and acid acidification. There were 37 risks at the end of the vulnerability assessment that rated high as either high likelihood of occurring or high severity of impact. And I'll put a link to that vulnerability assessment in the chat. Some of you may also have participated in the 2020 Habitat Master Plan update, which Kelly was referring to. This update set habitat protection and restoration targets for 2030 and long-term habitat goals for 2050 in recognition of climate effects. The habitat emphasis for TBEP changed in that process from restoring the balance to maximizing the potential. And Kelly already referred to accepting the inexorable change of salt marsh to mangroves that's going on because of warmer winters. We recently conducted a survey of TBEP staff, and based on their response, we're focusing on just a high priority list of 15 of vulnerabilities of the 37 vulnerabilities that were identified back in 2017. Last week, we had an initial discussion with the Climate Science Advisory Panel about potential actions to address these 15 high priority vulnerabilities. EPA's guidance for climate ready estuaries, which we're trying to complete through the CCMP update, asks TBEP to develop actions to mitigate any vulnerabilities or accept and monitor the vulnerability, or to avoid the vulnerability by modifying the TBEP goal. The discussion with the CSEP generated some great ideas for mitigation actions, but there are other vulnerabilities that will require in-depth interviews with subject matter experts in order to generate mitigation actions and monitoring strategies. Particularly at the CSEP meeting, we didn't have experts on fish and wildlife and ocean acidification present on the call. So we will be conducting interviews between now and May, and we'll return to the TAC with a draft set of actions for mitigation and monitoring, and we'll ask for the TAC's comments and suggestions on these draft actions at the June meeting. If there's any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll answer them now.
Thanks, Julie. Do we have any questions?
Great.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the next item, which is open discussion. And Marcus, this mentions the Tampa Bay benthic monitoring dashboard. I'm assuming that's you.
Yes, that is me. I'm open to any discussion on this as needed, but the two things I wanted to talk about were first, we have created a benthic monitoring dashboard. If you've been following our program for the last couple of years, we've been busy developing various dashboards as ways to make the data more accessible and synthesize a lot of the results from all of the partners that have been collecting this information. And I've been neglecting the benthic data for some time, but I'm pleased to say that this dashboard, I hope, provides a nice synthesis of that data set. It's about 30 years of information collected by EPC of Hillsborough County. Obviously a great resource, and hoping to really elevate it through this platform. I've gotten feedback from EPC on it so far, so they've seen it, they're aware of it. Obviously trying to make them involved in the process of making sure this is a useful product for them and does justice to the data. but definitely check it out if you haven't seen it yet. It's linked on our website under the data visualization section. Also, I think Sheila just put it in the chat here. But it just highlights some of the main results. The Tampa Bay benthic index um, as one tool that you can use. And whenever we're on these calls, this takes forever to load. There we go. So this is a synthesis of benthic data. So the invertebrates that are in the sediment or living near the sediment. One source of information we're tracking to report on health of the bay. Sediment contaminant information, another piece of information the EPC collects. They look at various contaminants in the sediment. I think it's over 100 actually, so quite a lot there. This is synthesized various ways. There's the probable effects level summary, which is kind of the graded system that looks at the ratio of all contaminants that are above a particular threshold that's deemed to be potentially harmful to the biota that live in the sediment. And then special study sites. And this is kind of a segue to the second thing I wanted to talk about. Each year, so the benthic monitoring, they do this every year at fixed stations, but each year TBEP has an opportunity to define particular sites that we're calling our special study sites that we think are areas of interest in a given year. And so we say, EPC, please go out and collect data at these particular locations that are of interest to us that may not be adequately covered by the routine monitoring. And we basically say we have ultimate say over or what those sites should be. And we've not done a good job of historically making those data available. They are obviously available in the source database that EPC provides, but this dashboard is meant to provide this in a nice, accessible format, all in one place. So definitely look at that. And what I want to do now is put out a call for potential special study sites this year. It will go on the dashboard when they're available, and we usually put out a call on the March 2nd quarterly meeting at the TAC, and actually finalize them at June. So I'm actually just saying right now, if anybody has any ideas for special study sites this year that you think are of interest, definitely speak now, and we can finalize those and get those approved at the next TAC meeting. If we don't hear any feedback, TBEP staff will definitely pick those sites and make the call. But obviously, we want to get feedback from you all if there are particular locations. So, Steve, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the Restore Center for Excellence at UF has got an NSF-funded project where they're looking at data handling, metadata archiving of benthic data in West Florida. Have they been in contact with you at all?
Not about that specific project. I've corresponded some with that group. I served on a grant review panel. But other than that, yeah, we've conversed with the Centers of Excellence program, but I'm not aware of that particular project. Do you know who is the PI on that, or?
Anna Broswell and Vince LaCour.
Okay.
This is all online, right? So I can send them your info.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is part of our open science approach, obviously, and we want to archive these data. It is available through source through the EPC's website, and it's linked on this dashboard if you're not aware of where that's available. But these data sets are synthesized to an extent where we've got the benthic index scores. The special study sites pulled out separately, the contaminant information summarized, and we're always looking for other ways to make the data more accessible. And if that involves, archiving in other efforts like you're talking about, Steve, or putting it on the KMB archive that I showed earlier for Mary's study, another option, but making it more accessible is the name of the game.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of thing they're looking for. So this could be helpful to them.
Yeah, definitely. Feel free to share this with them and CC me if you like.
You bet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, open call for special study sites. We haven't really discussed this internally yet, but if anybody has any suggestions, feel free to speak up or get in contact with me.
Thanks, Marcus. Any other items for open discussion from any of the members of the TAC?
I think we've requested a lot of feedback from you all at this meeting through the various presentations, and so we will probably send a follow-up email that has consolidated list of things to make it more clear what we're requesting of everybody and who are the relevant contacts for each of those. So look forward to that.
Yeah, I noticed the total tallies in the responses in Carrie's presentation were only in the 20s. And there was at max about 70 people in the meeting today. So I think we can do better than 20 responses to some of these surveys. I would hope. But yeah, an email with all of those links and information would be good. And I clicked on the new one. It tells me, Google tells me that it should only take 5 minutes to fill out that survey or less. Other items for open discussion? I believe we also have some announcements, including basis proceedings, which I think is also you, Marcus.
Yes, back to me. Yeah, so just a few announcements, or one from me and then one from Sheila. I know many of you were at basis and contributed to the proceedings, and if you did, you probably received an email update from me, but I just also wanted to remind this group that the proceedings are still happening. It's obviously been a long process to solicit all of the manuscripts from all the contributors and get them through formal peer review and set up a process with the journal Florida Scientist for having that published. But I'm happy to announce that all of the reviews are done. All of the papers were accepted. So good job, everybody. And we are expecting that special issue to be published likely this summer, if not sooner, in the Florida Scientist. So now it's just a matter of getting everything copy edited and making sure that the proofs are good to go. Special thanks to not only the contributors, but all of the guest editors that were part of that process. Holly Greening, Dave Carlin, Ed Sherwood, Aaron Brown, Kim Yates, and Carrie Flaherty-Walia all assisted in making sure that the papers were peer reviewed and of adequate scientific rigor. So kudos to everyone for that effort. And then Sheila, you had an announcement as well?
Yeah, I just want to put it on everybody's calendar that the Southwest Florida Seagrass Working Group, the Lake Transect training, is going to be on June 8th from 10 to noon. Hopefully red tide is gone by then, or at least not in our area. And the location still to be determined, but it'll likely be at the same like Skyway exit that we have had it the last couple of years. So make sure to mark your calendars. I'll be sending out an email to that listserv in probably a couple weeks, just as a reminder.
Thanks, Sheila. Another announcement, and Maya sent me a note during the meeting to make sure I highlighted this, but the next TAC meeting is in person, and I believe representatives from EPA will be attending, and they are hoping for I mean, we've had really good turnouts on the last couple of online meetings, but hoping for a good turnout for the in-person meeting in June. However, I won't be there in person for the June meeting, but I was asked to make sure we highlight that it is an in-person meeting, and it's June 21st at, well, the address is there.
It's the RPC,
Yeah.
PBRPC building.
It is the RPC?
Yep.
Okay.
And Maya asked me to make this point as well. So she wants everybody to know that it will be in person, which is great. And, not for lack of participation, as she always threatens, but I think, having these back in person will be very welcome among everybody. So look forward to that. And the fact that EPA personnel will be there is actually because we are undergoing our performance evaluation as an NEP. I believe that happens every 5 years. Is that right? Yeah. So we need to show EPA that we're doing great as a program, and the more people we have there that are participating in the TAC, the more better I guess we'll look. So
We'll
that's
make sure to
everybody's
have some coffee for you.
yeah.
Okay, open floor for any last comments, announcements, discussion. Anything? No? All right. Well, despite my strong anxieties, we may actually end the meeting a few minutes early then. Thanks, everyone. Some really good presentations today, and good to see everyone as usual.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Ryan, for
Thank
spearheading.
you. Have a good day.
Yeah.